Hello! I'm in the Netherlands. I've come all the way here to drive a Porsche that was available in the US because this sad-looking 924 is special in the engine bay. Gone is the stock 2-liter Volkswagen 4-cylinder engine producing about 125 horsepower, and in its place is a smaller 1.4-liter 4-cylinder engine producing 100 horsepower. Why? Well, to make sure this flying car is going to work. Obviously. The engine that's been swapped into this Porsche is an aircraft engine. We'll get to the PAL-V, a road-legal gyrocopter, in a bit, but first, the engine in here is a Rotax 912 ISC, a 1.35-liter boxer air-cooled 4-cylinder making 100 horsepower. Meant for aircraft. It's designed to operate at a steady RPM, cruising speed, in an airplane. It's an aircraft engine, so it is happy to sit at these higher RPMs for extended periods of time. Probably not the best for fuel consumption. The fun thing about this is it wasn't just a straight drop-in swap. They had to make several modifications to make this engine fit in a car where it's not designed to be. Because this is an aircraft engine, it wasn't designed to operate under load below 3,000 RPM. So they added a torsional damper to the front of it, which just looks like a big red flywheel hanging off the front. The air cooling of the cylinders of this engine was designed with the idea that the engine will be sitting in the front of a plane with a prop attached to the front of it, pulling the plane forward. That's why this engine had to be mounted with the output shaft facing forward, mostly for cooling. It doesn't sound terribly different from the stock engine.
Surprisingly, no, because that's a 4 in line, and this is a boxer.
And this is a boxer 4. Flat 4, or is it actually a boxer?
It's actually a boxer.
It's a boxer, okay. There are also some other reasons to mount the engine in here with the output shaft facing forward, but the output shaft is facing forward. The transmission's back there. This still has the stock 924 transmission, which is a transaxle at the back of the car with a long torque tube between the transmission and the engine. So to connect the output shaft of this engine that comes out of the front of it to the transmission torque tube that is behind and underneath the engine, the company that built this car built a belt drive box for the front of it. So power comes out of the front of the engine through the rotational damper and then is sent downward by this belt drive reduction box underneath the engine and back where it connects to the clutch on the front of the torque tube of the transmission, and then finally the power is sent through that torque tube to the transmission and then finally to the wheels. All of that power routing to make this engine fit in this engine bay. And the end result of this engine swap is, well, it works, and that's all it really has to do. It does rev match rather nicely with this engine.
It does.
There's also some changes on the inside. The gauge cluster is mostly stock, except the coolant temp gauge isn't hooked up to anything because the cylinders are air-cooled now, and the speedometer has been replaced with a GPS speedometer. I keep saying this engine is air-cooled. I should be a little more specific. The cylinders are air-cooled, but the heads are liquid-cooled, and there's some oil cooling for the engine as well. This is all stock, but this panel is new. There's now a really fancy startup sequence that makes you feel like you're in Top Gun, and then this little box up here is the diagnostic output screen from the Rotax ECU. But other than that, it's really mostly a stock Porsche 924 in here. A slightly heavily abused one. Let's do a little rev match downshift in front of this huge line of traffic. Oh, that's pretty good.
I know, right?
Yeah. Even though it's down on power from the original engine, this Rotax engine has a peaky, rev-happy nature to it that's actually quite a bit of fun. This is the PAL-V, a flying car. Don't worry, I'll explain the whole flying car thing in a bit. So what does that Porsche have to do with this? Well, this also has a Rotax 912 IS driving the rear wheels. The only reason this car has a Rotax 912 in it is to make sure that a Rotax 912 could withstand use in a car. The Rotax 912 was designed to operate at a steady RPM for hours on end, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 RPM. In the PAL-V, it's going to drive the wheels. It's going to be changing RPM all the time. It's going to be operating under load below 3,000 RPM. They put a Rotax 912 in this Porsche just to make sure it would survive that kind of use case. Sure, theoretically the engine would survive this kind of use case, but there's no better way to find out for sure than by sticking it in a car and having all your interns drive it about. And as it turns out, the Rotax 912 does work as a car engine. They've racked up 1,900 hours on the engine in that Porsche, and they've had very little issues with it. By the way, if you're worried they hacked apart a perfectly good Porsche 924 for this test bed, don't worry about it. When they got it, before they swapped out the engine, it had about 350,000 kilometers on it and was not in the best shape. Now, with this new engine, it has about 600,000 kilometers on it, and it's really not in the best shape. Now, you're probably wondering, why a Porsche as the test mule? Well, I don't actually know. I know they got it cheap, but I'm sure there were plenty of other options for cheap cars when they got this, so I have no idea. Shame they didn't get a Porsche 912 for the swap. That would have been perfect. So what is the PAL-V? Well, first of all, the name PAL-V is short for Personal Airland Vehicle. Presumably they put a dash in the name to stop people calling it PALV. The company PAL-V is based right here in the Netherlands in a small town with a very long name. This is a car with driven wheels that you can drive on the road. And then when you get to somewhere with a runway, you can move some gubbins about, transform it into a gyrocopter, and go flying. Full disclaimer, this is a prototype. They do plan to bring these to production, but this is a prototype. It can't fly or drive. In fact, this one doesn't even have engines in it. I paid my own way to get here. PAL-V didn't even invite me. I have no stake in the company whatsoever. I just wanted to see the incredible engineering that went into this thing, and hopefully you'll find the absurd engineering in this as fascinating as I do. This video is sponsored by Factor. Hey, I brought your food. Oh, thank goodness I was starving. What's that? Well, it's basically what you ordered. I'm hungry. Did you bring food or not? Look, you gotta stop eating this garbage fast food. Like I don't already know that. It's terrible, but as the name implies, it's fast. Besides, it's not like there's a ton of other options out here in rural Ohio. That's not where we are. It doesn't matter. I found you an alternative I want you to try. So, did you bring me food or did you only bring me literal garbage? This is a meal from Factor. Here, give it a shot. Well, B at best for presentation. Yeah, because a greasy brown sack looks so much better. Oh, this is butter chicken. And it's good. And it was easy. All I had to do was pick the meal, stab the film to vent it, and pop it in the microwave for 2 minutes. This is easily the best microwave meal I've ever had. Wait, why were you gone for 2 hours then? I had to go buy a trash can and fill it with trash to make a statement. Well, anyway, I like this. Are they all this good? Yes, but the best part is the convenience. It's delivered in a refrigerated box straight to your door, so it's way more convenient than fast food and not garbage. So you're gonna start bringing me these for lunch now, right? No, you're on your own. But you can use code AgingWheels50 at factor75.com for 50% off your first box and 20% off your next month of boxes. You sound like you're in a YouTube ad. Well, we are, so that's factor75.com and use code AgingWheels50. Thanks to Factor for sponsoring this video. What? Oh no. Oh, gone. Oh. Earlier I said this has a Rotax 912 engine in it. I kind of lied to you. It doesn't have a Rotax 912 engine. It has two. It has two Rotax engines that combine forces together to drive the pusher prop on the back of this thing. One Rotax engine didn't have enough power for flight, so they combined two together to push this thing forward through the air. And for the road use, only one of the engines drives the wheels through a 5-speed sequential manual gearbox. Before I get any further, I should really explain how this thing transforms into flight mode. This is the pusher prop in the back. It's currently in its stowed position tucked away behind some body panels, but if you were to unfold it in its current state, the car's too low and the prop would just strike the ground immediately. So the first part of the transformation is the suspension hydraulically lifts the car about a foot higher off the ground into flight mode position. Then this tail section, which is currently far too close to the car, telescopes backwards. Then the flight rotors get extended and locked in their outward positions. The amount of stress in those hinge joints and locking mechanisms must be incredible. Then this whole flight assembly, which in drive mode sits on the roof like some sort of ugly backpack, tilts up into the flight position. The two side body panels are then removed to free the pusher prop from its body panel cage and extend it into its outward usable position. Then some switches are flipped, some hydraulics are actuated, and it's in flight mode. It's a gyrocopter now. Totally not oversimplifying. By the way, I should mention, if you're not familiar, a gyrocopter is not a helicopter. This main rotor right here is unpowered. The thing that makes it spin is the air passing through it. A gyrocopter is much more similar to a fixed-wing airplane than it is to a helicopter, except instead of a big fixed wing, it has a rotary wing, which is why they went with the gyrocopter format, because this is a lot easier to fold up and stow away than a big fixed wing is. That said, this rotor is unpowered, but there is a pre-rotator motor which is exposed on this early prototype here, and its job is to get the rotor spinning to significantly reduce takeoff length. Otherwise, you'd have to go for quite a big distance to get these rotor blades up to speed with just the air passing through them. So it has a motor to kickstart that process. This much newer prototype also has a pre-rotator motor in it, but instead of being up on the top of the mast, the pre-rotator motor in this one is down in the body, and it's driving the rotor through a carbon fiber drive shaft that goes through the mast. Okay, now back to this wacky powertrain. As I mentioned earlier, it has two engines, and both of them drive the prop in the back. But they drive the prop through a one-way bearing and through a very slight angle bevel gear setup. So the engines can sit over here and it goes into an angle of the bevel gear. Now one of those engines drives the wheels. For the engine that drives the wheels, before it reaches the prop, power is sent through a sort of selector gearbox where the power can either be sent straight back to the prop or be diverted to a 5-speed sequential manual transmission. This airplane has a clutch pedal and it has flappy paddles behind the steering wheel to control your gears. Yes, it has 3 pedals like any other manual transmission car: clutch, brake, and gas, except in this case, because it's a sequential gearbox, there's no gear shift lever, you just have the paddles behind the wheel, which are currently connected to nothing because the engine has been removed in this one. But what do the pedals do in flight mode? Completely different functions. In flight mode, some switching happens, and it's no longer your clutch, brake, and gas. As far as I know, the middle pedal does nothing, and the 2 outer pedals become your rudder and differential braking controls for flight. In addition, in flight mode, the steering wheel just becomes useless. I mean, you can still steer the front wheel with it, but you're not going to be doing much with that in the air. And instead, there's a flight stick that rises up between my legs in the front seat here, and that becomes the flight stick. And the throttle moves to the hand throttle on the side over here, instead of the foot throttle, which now controls rudders and stuff. Power is sent from a limited slip differential in the middle down through universal jointed drive shafts, which are covered by these carbon fiber spats here. Because of how much the suspension in the rear raises and lowers, these drive shafts have to operate at quite a significant angle, and I've seen a testing rig they have here to make sure that angle works. The rear suspension is swing arms, quite long swing arms, and the front suspension is a double wishbone assembly, which is the exact opposite of most Delta tripod configured vehicles. And the brakes, it has brake discs on all 3 wheels, are carbon. Not carbon ceramic. The brake discs are essentially just carbon fiber. When I heard that, I thought, well, that's not going to work, is it? But I'm told that that's also what F-16 fighter jets use for their brake discs, just straight carbon. So why is it a 3-wheeler? Well, one of the smaller reasons is apparently takeoff and landing is more stable with 3 wheels as opposed to a quad wheel layout. But obviously the main reason this is a 3-wheeler is because of regulation. They're certifying this thing for air and road use pretty much everywhere, and the whole road use certification part is a lot easier if you only have 3 wheels. For instance, 4-wheeled cars, in the US at least, are required to have airbags and a whole host of other features, but we're talking about airbags right now. But aircraft are not allowed to have airbags. So make this a 3-wheeled car, you remove the airbag requirement, and then you can actually do this. By the way, regulations are also the reason it looks like this in the front, sort of the stalk-eyed fly look. This is the regulation width for headlights, apparently. I don't know this to be true, but I imagine in the US, because this has 3 wheels, they're going to have to fit a center headlight on it, which is going to look even weirder. Of course, one of the downsides of a 3-wheeler as far as road use is stability. But the lengths they've gone through to make sure this thing is as stable as possible with 3 wheels is absurd. This is the PAL V1, a very early prototype, and the way they tackled stability on this one was to make it actively, hydraulically lean into corners, like a carver. It tilted into the corner no matter which way you were going. Stability on this one has been quite simplified. Instead of doing active tilting, this one just is lower and therefore more stable. And the engines in the back are quite low down, so that lowers the center of gravity. They made this one stable enough that they don't need to do the active tilting thing. It still has hydraulic suspension, but the job of the hydraulic suspension in this one isn't tilting, it's just raising it up and down. Speaking of this old prototype, it doesn't have 2 engines. It has 1 single engine, which makes the gearbox quite a bit simpler, and I believe it's lighter as well. It's a 13B rotary engine from Mazda that's been heavily supercharged. The reason they didn't stick with this engine is because it proved quite difficult to certify this engine for aircraft use. So instead, they picked an engine that was already certified for aircraft use and then went down the path of certifying it for road use, which, as I understand, is a bit easier. The reason it has 2 engines instead of 1 bigger engine is because big aircraft engines are really, really dirty. Apparently this Rotax engine is just clean enough to get by for road use and to be certifiable for road use. And it has two of them because one wouldn't be powerful enough for flight. Inside the PAL V is actually quite nicely appointed. This is not a production version. I'm sure the production version will look different, if it exists at all, but this one's quite nice. If you look down at the seat, it feels car-like, and then if you look up, it doesn't anymore, because the dash is all covered in airplane stuff. This whole panel here is just for managing both of the engines, because again, it has two of them. Right above that is radio controls for aircrafty things. There's some light switches over here, again for aircrafty things. I'm not a pilot, I bet you couldn't tell. In the middle here is an avionics panel that has attitude? Is that what that gauge is called? And then that's a compass. I don't need to be a pilot to figure that one out. Right next to that is a screen for driving stuff. There's a speedometer and a tachometer, and it looks like nothing else. There's some switches next to that, park lock, hazard. I know what hazard lights are. You've got reverse unlock. I don't know what that is, and then a horn button. In front of me is a steering wheel. There's some paddles for gear selection behind that steering wheel, and then on the dash above that is an altimeter, which you don't see in most cars typically, and an airspeed indicator. Again, not something you see in most cars typically. And then rotor RPM. Oh, that's gyrocopter stuff. There's a rotor brake over here and a USB charging port. And then this blinker stock over here is from a Mercedes van, I'm told. Something this has that you would totally expect from a car, but not all small aircraft have, is a luggage compartment. Behind the front seats, it goes all the way the width of the vehicle. The body of the PAL V is all carbon fiber, and the chassis is steel tube frame and carbon fiber, and the windows, at least in this prototype, are all polycarbonate. The side windows don't roll down or vent in any way. They obviously don't roll down because weight, and there's nothing to roll them down into. There's also a window down here. They told me that the production version might have some sort of vent or maybe a flap that opens up. We'll have to see if it hits production, what it has. For climate controls, it won't have air conditioning, at least at the beginning, because it saves on weight and complexity and because they couldn't figure out where to put an air conditioner, but it will have heat. But interestingly, the heat will be done electrically. Not because the engine is air-cooled, because the heads are still water-cooled. They could do a standard coolant loop heater if they wanted to, but an electric heater was lighter. I feel like I'm forgetting to tell you a few details, but in a nutshell, that's the PAL V. And the big question you might have is, who is this for? Well, the buyer's going to have a lot of money, because obviously this isn't going to be cheap. I guess in the aircraft world, it's not terribly priced, but they told me that their target price is around 400,000 euros. I don't know what it'll actually be if and when it comes to production, but that's what they're targeting, and that's a lot of money. But really, in the context of all the engineering and the certification work they've had to do for both road and air use, maybe that price isn't so bad. I'm just here to appreciate the engineering. I don't really understand how this would fit into someone's life, and I also don't understand being able to afford something like this. But just because I don't understand it and I don't see the use case doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. There's 7 billion people on the planet. Surely a few thousand of those 7 billion people have the perfect use case for this and can afford it. Regardless of who buys this thing, I think we can all appreciate the absurd engineering that went into this thing and the insanity of the people that chose to take on this challenge, and that they've got this far. Like I said, this prototype doesn't fly or drive, but that old one behind me has flown, and it has driven. And the other orange prototype that you saw unfolding on B-roll earlier, that one not only drives, but is road legal. It's road certified. And the next step is air certification. They're using that other prototype to achieve air certification, and the third prototype they build, they tell me, will be fully road and air certified. So they are making progress. Whether or not they make it to production, that remains to be seen, but I'm glad I had a chance to look at this one. Thanks to PAL V for letting me film their stuff in their space, and thanks to PAL V for giving me a reason to finally make my way to Europe. The way this video came about is last year I got an email from a viewer telling me about an interesting car that he just bought, and at the end of this email he casually mentioned, "Oh, by the way, I work at a flying car company." To which I responded, "Please tell me more. Also, can I come make a video maybe?" The viewer that sent me that email was Sonder, who you saw riding with me in the Porsche earlier. But anyway, thanks to PAL V for putting up with me. Thanks to Sonder for arranging this whole thing, showing me around the Netherlands and letting me drive his Mia. That was the interesting car that he bought. And thanks to you for watching.